The morning sun had barely peeked through the clouds when Rita checked her worn-out phone one last time, making sure she had the right address. Standing at the gates of the massive estate, she took a deep breath, adjusting her simple blue uniform. 20 years of cleaning houses had taught her to stay professional, but something about this mansion made her heart beat faster than usual. "Good morning, ma'am," the security guard said, checking his list. "You must be the new housekeeper." His friendly smile helped ease her nerves a bit. Rita nodded, clutching her bag of cleaning supplies closer. As she walked up the winding driveway, memories flooded back. Memories she usually kept locked away. 15 years had passed since that terrible day when her 8-year-old boy disappeared from the park. She'd been watching him play, just like any other Sunday afternoon. One minute he was there, laughing on the swings, and the next, gone. The police searches, the missing posters, the endless nights of hoping. Nothing had brought him back. The mansion's grand entrance door swung open, revealing Mr. Chen, the wealthy tech businessman who now owned the place. He wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than Rita's yearly salary, but his warm smile seemed genuine enough. "Welcome to our home," he said, gesturing for her to come inside. "Mrs. Lee will show you around. She manages the household staff." Rita followed a middle-aged woman through the house, trying to focus on her instructions about cleaning schedules and special requirements. But her eyes kept wandering to the family photos lining the hallways. Mr. Chen with his wife, their fancy parties, and their adopted son. That's when she saw him, just a glimpse through a window. A young man playing basketball in the courtyard. Something about his movements made her stop mid-step. The way he bounced the ball, the slight tilt of his head, it was like seeing a ghost from her past. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Lee asked, noticing Rita's distraction. "Yes, sorry," Rita quickly replied, forcing herself to look away. Just admiring the view. But her hands were shaking as she gripped her cleaning cart tighter. Throughout that first morning, Rita tried to focus on her work, dusting expensive vases, polishing marble floors, and organizing cleaning supplies in her designated storage closet. But her mind kept drifting to the young man she'd seen. She knew she was probably imagining things. After all, she'd spent years seeing her lost son and random teenagers on the street, always leading to disappointment. Yet something felt different this time. As she cleaned the living room windows, she overheard a conversation from the garden. The young man was talking to someone on his phone, and his laugh, that specific, unique laugh, sent chills down her spine. It was the same laugh that used to echo through her small apartment 15 years ago. Rita sank into one of the plush cleaning chairs, her legs weak. She pulled out her ancient wallet and the worn photo she always carried, her little boy's last school picture. The same dimple when he smiled, the same way of standing with one shoulder slightly higher than the other. But she couldn't let herself hope. Not again. She had a job to do, bills to pay. Getting lost in old memories and wild theories would only lead to more heartbreak. Still, as she gathered her cleaning supplies and headed to the next room, she couldn't shake the feeling that fate had brought her to this house for a reason. After a week at the mansion, Rita couldn't shake off the strange feelings that kept growing stronger. Every morning, she'd arrive early, her heart racing whenever she heard footsteps, hoping to catch another glimpse of the young man she now knew was called Alex. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Rita was carefully dusting the family photos in the main hallway when she noticed something she hadn't seen before. In one of the newer pictures, Alex was wearing a small silver chain around his neck. Her hands froze mid-dust. That chain looked exactly like the one she'd given her son on his 8th birthday. A simple silver rope with a tiny basketball charm. "Beautiful photos, aren't they?" A voice said behind her, making her jump. It was Mrs. Chen, the lady of the house, holding a cup of morning tea. "Alex was such a blessing when he came to us." Rita's throat felt dry. How old was he when you adopted him?" she managed to ask, trying to sound casual while her heart hammered in her chest. He was 8. Mrs. Chin smiled, touching one of the frames. Poor thing was so confused and scared at first. Found wandering alone in the city, no one knowing where he came from. 8 years old, the same age, the same time. Rita's cleaning cloth slipped from her trembling fingers. Just then, Alex walked past the hallway, heading to the kitchen. He was wearing basketball shorts and a sleeveless shirt, showing off a small birthmark on his left shoulder. A light brown mark shaped like a tiny crescent moon. Rita had to grab the wall for support. Her son had that exact same birthmark. "Are you feeling all right?" Mrs. Chen asked, looking concerned. "You've gone quite pale." "I'm fine," Rita whispered. Just a bit tired." Throughout the day, Rita found herself following the sounds of Alex's voice through the house. The way he said certain words, his quiet humming while reading, it was like hearing echoes from her past. She noticed how he'd tap his fingers on tables when thinking, just like her son used to drum his fingers on their old kitchen counter. During lunch break, Rita sat alone in the staff room, her sandwich untouched. She pulled out her phone and opened the folder of old photos she digitized years ago. Her fingers shook as she zoomed in on her son's 8th birthday party photo. There it was, the silver chain with the basketball charm glinting in the birthday cake's candlelight. Later that afternoon, while cleaning the family room, she overheard Alex talking to his friend on the phone about strange dreams he'd been having. "It's weird," he said. "I keep dreaming about this tiny apartment with yellow curtains and the smell of vanilla cookies." Rita's breath caught in her throat. Their old apartment had yellow curtains, and she used to bake vanilla cookies every Sunday. These couldn't all be coincidences, could they? As she gathered her cleaning supplies at the end of her shift, Rita noticed Alex's basketball lying in the hallway. Without thinking, she picked it up, her fingers finding a familiar rough spot, the kind that forms when someone draws on a ball with a permanent marker. Her son used to mark all his basketballs with a tiny star. With trembling hands, she turned the ball slowly, her heart nearly stopping when she found what she was looking for. A faded, barely visible star mark, exactly where her son used to draw it. That night, Rita couldn't sleep. The basketball with its faded star kept spinning in her mind. After tossing and turning until dawn, she made a decision. She had to know more. During her morning cleaning routine, she found herself outside Alex's bedroom. The family was out for breakfast, giving her a perfect chance to look around. Her hands shook as she opened the door. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a young man. Sports posters on the walls, a messy desk with a laptop, and clothes scattered about. But Rita wasn't here for surface cleaning. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for anything that might connect to her past. The closet caught her attention. Unlike the rest of the room, it was surprisingly organized. As she ran her duster along the top shelf, her cloth caught on something. Standing on tiptoe, she reached back and found a small wooden box pushed far into the corner. Rita's heart nearly stopped. The box looked handmade, with clumsy carpenter's marks, exactly like the one her son had made in his school woodworking class. She remembered how proud he'd been, even though the lid didn't quite fit right and the corners weren't perfectly square. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside, wrapped in an old t-shirt, she found treasures that made her sink to the floor. A small collection of items that didn't seem to fit Alex's current life. A battered Hot Wheels car, red with a missing wheel, just like the one her son had refused to throw away. A faded friendship bracelet with blue and green threads, the colors she used to wear. And at the bottom, folded carefully, a piece of yellowed paper. Rita carefully unfolded it. It was a child's drawing, the colors faded but still clear enough to make out. A small house with yellow curtains, a woman with curly hair baking in the kitchen, and a little boy playing with a ball. In wobbly handwriting at the bottom, "Me and Mama." Tears blurred her vision. This was her son's drawing, the one that had hung on the refrigerator for years. She thought it had been lost forever, just like him. Suddenly, she heard voices downstairs. The family was back. In her panic to put everything back exactly as she found it, something small fell from between the papers. A hospital bracelet, tiny enough for a child's wrist, with a date that made her blood run cold, the day after her son disappeared. The voices were getting closer. Rita quickly tucked everything back into the box, placed it exactly where she'd found it, and grabbed her cleaning supplies. Just as she stepped out, she nearly collided with Alex in the hallway. "Oh, sorry," he said, steadying her. "Were you cleaning my room?" Up close, she could see every detail of his face. The small scar above his right eyebrow from falling off his bike when he was 6, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners just like hers. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice surprisingly steady despite her pounding heart. "Just finishing up." He smiled at her, that familiar dimple appearing in his left cheek. "Thanks. You know, it's funny. Every time you're around, I get this weird feeling, like deja vu or something. Crazy, right?" Rita clutched her cleaning cart tighter. "Maybe not so crazy," she whispered, but he had already walked into his room, closing the door behind him. She stood there, frozen, knowing that the wooden box held the truth that would change both their lives forever. After finding the wooden box, Rita spent her evening hunched over her old laptop, digging through online newspaper archives. Her tiny apartment felt stuffier than usual as she searched article after article about missing children from 15 years ago. The screen's glow illuminated her determined face as midnight approached. Something caught her eye. A small article about a private adoption agency that had suddenly closed down right after her son disappeared. The agency's name appeared in another article about Mr. Chen's charitable donations. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, following this new lead. "This can't be real," she whispered, staring at her screen. Records showed that Alex had been processed through that same agency, just 3 days after her son vanished. The adoption had been rushed through, with paperwork that now seemed suspiciously incomplete. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister. "Found that old photo album you asked about. There's something weird. Remember that man who kept hanging around the park before it happened?" Rita's hands trembled as she opened the attached photo. It was from the park, taken just days before her son disappeared. In the background, barely noticeable, stood a man in a suit. The same man she'd seen visiting the Chen mansion last week, listed in the papers as the family's longtime lawyer. The next morning at work, Rita noticed something different. The mansion was buzzing with activity. Caterers setting up in the kitchen, florists arranging elaborate displays. Mrs. Chen was hosting a charity gala that evening. While cleaning the study, Rita overheard Mr. Chen talking on the phone. "Make sure those old adoption records stay buried," he said in a low voice. "We can't risk anyone looking too closely, especially now." Her heart raced. She wasn't imagining things. Pretending to dust the bookshelf, she edged closer to his desk. A folder lay open, revealing documents from the old adoption agency. Before she could read more, Mr. Chen returned. "Oh," he said, quickly closing the folder. "I didn't realize you were here." His friendly smile seemed forced now, his eyes darting to the papers he'd just hidden. Later that day, while organizing the storage room, Rita found a box of old family videos. Her hands shook as she slipped one into the nearby player. The screen flickered to life, showing Alex's first day with the family. He looked confused, scared, and he was wearing the same clothes her son had on the day he disappeared. The door creaked behind her. It was Alex. "What are you watching?" he asked, then froze as he saw the screen. I remember that day. Kind of. Everything before it is fuzzy, like a dream." He touched his silver chain nervously. "Sometimes I dream about another house, another mom who looks kind of like you, actually." Rita's throat tightened. "Do you ever wonder about your life before? About your birth family?" Alex sat down beside her, eyes fixed on the screen. All the time. Dad gets angry when I ask, though. Says I should be grateful. He paused, then added quietly, "Yesterday, I found some weird papers in his office. About the adoption agency. Some of the dates don't match what they told me." Rita's heart pounded. Should she tell them what she discovered? Show them the evidence she gathered? Before she could decide, Mrs. Chen's voice echoed down the hallway, calling Alex to get ready for the gala. He stood up, hesitating at the door. "You know what's strange? That vanilla cookie smell that follows you around, it's exactly like in my dreams." With that, he was gone, leaving Rita with tears in her eyes and proof mounting that her search might finally be over. The charity gala was in full swing downstairs, but Rita's mind was racing upstairs in the quiet study. The folder she'd seen earlier was still there on Mr. Chen's desk, practically calling to her. With trembling hands, she opened it, her heart stopping as she read the contents. Adoption papers, dated just days after her son's disappearance, with obvious inconsistencies in the dates and details. The sound of footsteps made her quickly close the folder, but not fast enough. Mr. Chen stood in the doorway, his face changing from surprise to anger as he saw what she was holding. "You shouldn't be in here," he said coldly, all his usual warmth gone. "The party guests aren't allowed upstairs." "I know what you did." Rita's voice was quiet but steady. She held up the hospital bracelet she'd found in Alex's box. "This is from the day after my son disappeared, the same day your lawyer was seen at that park." Mr. Chen's face paled slightly, but he quickly composed himself. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're just a housekeeper who's clearly overstepped her boundaries." "A housekeeper who used to have a little boy." Rita's voice grew stronger. "A boy who disappeared 15 years ago. A boy who loved basketball and drew stars on his balls. A boy who made a crooked wooden box in school and wore a silver chain with a basketball charm." The sound of breaking glass made them both turn. Alex stood in the doorway, a shattered water glass at his feet, his face a mask of shock. He was wearing a suit for the gala, but his hand was clutching that same silver chain around his neck. "Dad?" His voice cracked. "What's she talking about?" Mr. Chen moved toward him. "Son, don't listen to her. She's clearly disturbed. Stop calling me son." Alex's voice rose. "I heard you on the phone yesterday about keeping the adoption records buried, and I found these." He pulled out some papers from his jacket. Birth certificates. 2 different ones with different dates, different parents. The room felt like it was spinning. Rita stepped forward, her voice gentle. "You were 8 when you disappeared. We lived in a yellow house with vanilla cookies baking every Sunday. You had a red Hot Wheels car you wouldn't throw away, even with a missing wheel. You made me a friendship bracelet, blue and green." Alex's eyes widened. The dreams? They weren't dreams, were they? Mr. Chen suddenly moved to his desk, grabbing the folder. "This is ridiculous. I gave you everything. A better life, the best schools, opportunities you never would have had. You stole him." Rita's voice cracked with emotion. "You stole my baby and made him forget who he was. Is it true?" Alex's question cut through the air like a knife. Did you take me?" The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Chen's shoulders slumped, the fight seeming to drain out of him. I thought I was doing the right thing. We couldn't have children. The agency said they could fast-track an adoption. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know." A sob escaped Alex's throat. He backed away from Mr. Chen, moving closer to Rita. Something in his eyes had changed. Recognition, perhaps, or the stirring of long-buried memories. The sound of police sirens drifted up from outside. Rita's sister had called them after discovering the connection between the lawyer and the park. As footsteps thundered up the stairs, Alex reached out and took Rita's hand, just like he used to do as a little boy. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements and shocked party guests leaving the mansion. Alex sat in the kitchen, his perfectly pressed suit now wrinkled, staring at old photos Rita had brought from her apartment. His entire world had shattered in a single evening. "This one," Rita said softly, pointing to a photo of a birthday party. "You just turned 7. You insisted on having a basketball cake, even though I could barely make a regular one." Her voice trembled with emotion. Alex touched the photo gently. "I'd remember. I'd remember the taste of the blue frosting." His eyes filled with tears. "How could I forget everything? How could they make me forget my own mother?" The police had explained it earlier, a combination of trauma, age, and careful manipulation. The lawyer had confessed everything. How they'd spotted Rita's son at the park, how they'd arranged his disappearance, how they'd used drugs to keep him confused during the transition. The entire scandal was already spreading through the mansion's security cameras that had captured Mr. Chen's confession. Mrs. Chen sat in the corner, crying quietly. She kept saying she hadn't known, that she believed the adoption was legal. But Alex couldn't even look at her. "The vanilla cookies," he said suddenly, turning to Rita. "Every Sunday, I remember begging to lick the spoon." His hand went to the silver chain around his neck. "And this, you gave it to me because I made the basketball team at school." Rita nodded, unable to speak. Outside, camera flashes lit up the driveway as news vans arrived. The story of the wealthy businessman who had bought a stolen child was too big to contain. "I don't know who I am anymore," Alex whispered. "Am I still Alex, or am I?" "You're my son," Rita said gently, "but you're also the person you've become. We have time to figure everything out." A police officer entered the kitchen. "Mrs. Chen has agreed to move to a hotel," she announced, "and Mr. Chen will remain in custody. Would you like us to escort you both home?" Alex looked panicked. "Home? But where? Which home?" Rita touched his arm gently. "Whatever you want. Whatever you need. We can take this one day at a time." He looked around the fancy kitchen, at the life he'd thought was his. Then he looked at Rita, seeing his own eyes reflected in hers, feeling a connection that 15 years of separation couldn't erase. Could I see your house?" he asked hesitantly. "Our house." Rita's heart soared, but she kept her voice calm. "Of course. It's small, nothing like this place, but does it still have yellow curtains?" He interrupted, a small smile playing on his lips. "The very same ones," she whispered. "I never changed them. I never changed anything, always hoping." Alex stood up, his movements decisive despite his red-rimmed eyes. "I want to go home, my real home." He paused, then added softly, "Mom." The word hung in the air like a precious gift. Rita had waited 15 years to hear it again. As they walked out of the mansion together, past the news crews and police cars, Alex carrying the wooden box of his childhood treasures, neither of them looked back. In the police car, Alex held the old photo album close to his chest. "Tell me everything," he said. "Tell me about every birthday, every Christmas, every normal day I can't remember. Help me find myself again." Rita took his hand, just as she had done thousands of times when he was small. "We have all the time in the world now," she said, "and I remember everything. Every single moment." The courthouse buzzed with tension as Rita and Alex walked through the metal detectors. 2 months had passed since that night at the mansion, and today Mr. Chen would face justice. News cameras flashed as they made their way down the hallway, Alex protectively holding his mother's arm. "You okay?" he whispered to Rita, seeing her hands shake as they entered the courtroom. She nodded, squeezing his hand. These past weeks had been a whirlwind of DNA tests, legal meetings, and emotional discoveries. Each day brought back more memories for Alex, some happy, some painful, all pieces of the puzzle of his stolen childhood. The prosecutor stood before the packed courtroom, her voice firm as she presented the evidence. Security footage from the mansion showing Mr. Chen's confession. The fake adoption papers. The lawyer's detailed testimony about the network of stolen children sold to wealthy families. Photos of other missing kids who had disappeared the same way. This isn't just about one child, the prosecutor said, gesturing to where Alex sat. This is about dozens of families torn apart by greed. Mr. Chen didn't just buy a son. He bought into a criminal enterprise that destroyed countless lives. Alex tensed as Mr. Chen was brought in. The man looked smaller now in his orange jumpsuit, nothing like the powerful figure who had ruled the mansion. Their eyes met briefly across the courtroom, and Alex felt Rita's hand tighten around his. Mrs. Chen testified through tears, maintaining she hadn't known the truth. "I loved him like my own," she said, looking at Alex pleadingly. "I still do." During a break, Alex and Rita sat on a courthouse bench, sharing a bag of vanilla cookies Rita had baked that morning, their new Sunday tradition restored. "The house feels different now," Alex said quietly. "Warmer, like it's slowly remembering me too." He'd moved back in with Rita 2 weeks ago, taking small steps to rebuild their life together. "Yesterday, I found him sitting in his old room," Rita told their lawyer during another break, "just touching the walls, looking at the old height marks I never painted over. He remembered how we used to measure him every month." The evidence was overwhelming. Document after document showed how Mr. Chen had wielded his wealth and influence to hide his crimes. The lawyer broke down on the stand, revealing how they had targeted specific children, always from working-class families who couldn't fight back against the system. When it was Alex's turn to testify, his voice started shaky but grew stronger as he spoke. He described the confusion of those first days, the gradual replacement of his real memories with fake ones, the dreams that had never quite let him forget his true home. "I had everything money could buy," he said, looking directly at Mr. Chen. "But I never had peace. Something was always missing. And now I know what it was. Truth. Love that doesn't need to be bought." The reporters scribbled frantically as more details emerged about the trafficking ring. Other families came forward, telling similar stories of lost children and suspicious adoptions. The case was becoming bigger than anyone had imagined. As the day drew to a close, the judge ordered everyone to return tomorrow for more testimony. Outside the courthouse, Rita and Alex faced the media together. A reporter asked Alex how he felt about his privileged life being a lie. "Money can't buy real love," he answered, his arm around Rita's shoulders. "I'd rather live in a small house with yellow curtains and the smell of vanilla cookies, knowing I'm where I truly belong." Later that night, as they drove home to their modest house, Alex reached for Rita's hand. "Thank you," he said softly, "for never stopping looking for me, for keeping my room, my memories, my heart safe until I found my way back." 3 months after the trial began, Rita woke up to the sound of bouncing basketball in the backyard. Through the kitchen window, she watched Alex practicing shots in the early morning light. He'd started playing again, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of the game. The newspaper on the kitchen table carried the headline, "Millionaire sentenced, 25 years for child trafficking." Below was a smaller headline, "5 more families reunited with missing children." The case had blown open a nationwide scandal, leading to more discoveries, more tearful reunions, more healing. Rita poured 2 cups of coffee, adding extra sugar to Alex's, just the way he'd liked it as a child, a detail that had somehow stayed with him even during his years at the mansion. She smiled, remembering how surprised he'd been when she'd made it that way on his first morning back home. "You remembered," he called out as she brought the coffee outside. He was wearing his old college basketball jersey, but now it felt different, like his choice, not something bought to create a perfect image. They sat on the worn wooden steps together, watching the sun rise. "I had that dream again," Alex said quietly, "about the day it took me. But this time, it was different. This time, I could see your face clearly, calling my name." Rita touched his shoulder gently. The therapy sessions they'd been attending together were helping him process everything. "The memories are coming back because you're ready for them now," she said. Inside, the phone rang. Mrs. Chen calling for her weekly check-in. After the trial, she turned state's evidence, helping prosecutors track down other families involved in the trafficking ring. Alex had struggled with his feelings toward her, but eventually agreed to limited contact. She was, after all, the only mother he'd known for 15 years. "Tell her about the community center," Rita suggested as Alex went to answer the phone. He'd started volunteering there, coaching basketball for kids from struggling families. It was his way of giving back, of healing. Later that morning, they drove to the local diner for breakfast, their new Saturday tradition. The waitress, who'd known Rita for years, beamed at them. "Your usual orders?" she asked. "Blueberry pancakes for you, Rita, and chocolate chip for your boy." Alex's eyes widened. "That was my favorite breakfast," he said softly. "Every Saturday before." Rita nodded, fighting back tears. "You always said the chocolate chips had to make a smiley face." As they ate, Alex shared his plans for going back to college. "I want to study social work," he said. "Help other kids who've been through trauma. Maybe even work with adoption agencies to prevent what happened to me." A young mother at the next table was trying to calm her crying toddler. Without hesitation, Alex pulled out his keys, jingling them to distract the child. The baby's tears turned to giggles. "You used to do that with the neighbor's kids," Rita said, watching him. "Some things never change." On their way home, they stopped at the park, the same one where Alex had disappeared all those years ago. It had been hard coming back here at first, but they'd made new memories now. Every weekend, they'd walk here together, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. "I found this yesterday," Alex said, pulling something from his pocket. An old photo of him and Rita at this very park, taken just days before he was taken. "It was in that box of memories you kept. Look at how you're looking at me." Rita studied the photo, seeing the pure love in her younger self's eyes. "That's how I looked at you every day," she said, "and how I look at you now." "I know," Alex smiled, that familiar dimple appearing. "I can feel it. Every day, I feel more like myself. Not the perfect son they tried to create, but your son. The real me." 1 year had passed since that life-changing day at the mansion. The small house with yellow curtains was filled with morning sunlight as Rita put the finishing touches on a special breakfast. Today was Alex's first day as a counselor at the Child Advocacy Center, and she wanted everything to be perfect. The smell of vanilla pancakes filled the kitchen, not cookies this time, but still carrying that same sweet scent of home. Alex came downstairs in his new suit, adjusting his tie nervously. The silver basketball charm still hung around his neck, now joined by a new pendant Rita had given him for his birthday. A small key, symbolizing his journey home. "Ready for your big day?" Rita asked, sliding a plate of pancakes across the counter. She'd drawn a smiley face with chocolate chips, just like old times. "Almost," Alex smiled, that familiar dimple showing. "Just need my lucky charm." He pulled out the old wooden box from his backpack, the same one that had helped uncover the truth. Inside, next to his childhood treasures, lay his new counseling certification. The morning news played quietly on the kitchen TV. A reporter was covering the latest developments. In the wake of the Chen adoption scandal, new laws have been passed to protect vulnerable families. 6 more children have been reunited with their birth parents this month alone. Alex turned it off gently. "Sometimes I still can't believe how many of us there were," he said quietly. "But at least now, we're helping others find their way home too." The doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Chen, standing nervously on the porch with a small gift bag. After months of therapy and honest conversations, they'd reached a delicate understanding. She'd lost everything: her husband, her mansion, her social status. But she'd gained something more valuable: the truth, and a chance to make things right. "I thought you might want this for your office," she said, handing Alex a framed photo. It was from one of his high school basketball games, but he'd had it modified to include both Mrs. Chen and Rita in the stands. "Both parts of your journey matter," she added softly. Rita watched them embrace, remembering how far they'd all come. The healing hadn't been easy, but it had been real. Every tear, every late-night conversation, every remembered moment had brought them closer to peace. As they drove to the advocacy center, they passed the mansion, now converted into a support center for families of missing children. Alex's story had inspired the change, turning a symbol of wealth and deception into one of hope and healing. "You know what I realized?" Alex said, looking at the building. "Everything they gave me, the expensive schools, the fancy clothes, the big house, none of it compared to what I had all along. A mother's love can't be bought." At the center's entrance, Rita straightened Alex's tie one last time. "Your first client is coming in an hour," she reminded him. "A little boy who just found his real family." "Just like me," Alex smiled. Then he hugged her tightly, whispering, "Thank you, Mom, for never giving up, for keeping my heart safe until I found my way back." Rita watched him walk into the building, tears of joy in her eyes. Through the window, she could see him setting up his office, placing the wooden box on his desk, hanging the modified photo on the wall, arranging his counseling books next to a framed photo of their small house with its yellow curtains. As she drove to work, still cleaning houses, but now running her own successful company, Rita smiled at the thought of their evening plans. Basketball in the backyard, vanilla cookies in the oven, and the simple joy of being together. Their story had changed laws, reunited families, and proved that love could bridge any gap, even one 15 years wide. The truth had finally won, wrapped in the scent of vanilla and the warmth of yellow curtains, proving that sometimes the smallest homes hold the biggest hearts, and the longest journeys can lead right back where you belong.